The UN Climate Conference in Poland agrees to unblock millions of dollars to help poor countries cope with the effects of climate change.
Citizens in flood-prone areas are urged to brace themselves for heavy rains over the next few days as the Rainfall, Drainage and Flood Watch Committee is activated.
And government's motion in recognition of International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women on November 25 is passed in Parliament unopposed.
And of course, we will bring you the latest sporting action in the Diamond Mineral Water and NCN Sport News. Good evening, I'm Natasha Smith.
And I'm Paul Moore.
With this edition of the 6 o'clock news for today, Friday, December 12, 2008. Here's what's happening. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Natasha. Delegates at the UN Climate Conference have agreed to unblock millions of dollars to help poor countries cope with the effects of climate change. The agreement was one of the main achievements of negotiators who hope to agree on a new climate change treaty by next December. Here's more.
UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has urged rich and poor nations to agree on new steps to fight global warming, telling a 189-nation conference that Europe and the United States must take the lead in avoiding a climate change catastrophe. And to this effect, delegates have agreed to unblock millions of dollars to help poor countries cope with the effects of climate change. Government ministers have recognized the legal right to operate a climate change fund that now has about 60 million euros, which could be worth $300 million a year by 2012. But until now, the fund could not operate because its board had no right to sign contracts, and reports say it could still take up to a year before money is distributed to poor nations. Cash to prepare for global warming will be raised mainly by a 2% levy on a system of UN green investments in developing nations. The United Nations says tens of billions of dollars a year are likely to be needed by 2030 to cope with the impacts of climate change. But the European Union was worried that too easy access to cash could set a bad precedent in an economic downturn. In the meantime, European Union ministers at the Poznan talks expressed relief after EU leaders in Brussels agreed on a historic pact to cut greenhouse gases by 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. And former U.S. President Al Gore won the biggest applause of the conference with a speech predicting a far more active U.S. climate policy under President-elect Barack Obama after President George W. Bush. He also said a new UN climate deal could be agreed as planned at a meeting in Copenhagen in late 2009 despite the recession. But Guyana's President Barra Jagdeo also had his share of applause yesterday when he urged the developed world to demonstrate political will at a time when it is needed the most. President Jagdeo cautioned leaders against judging this phenomenon as merely an environmental issue since it can disrupt socio-economic progress globally. While the President is on a mission to ensure that standing forests are valued in the next climate agreement, he expressed fear that movement to combat the phenomenon is losing momentum. He believes that current actions to stabilize the global economy may divert attention from the bigger crisis that climate change presents. In the meantime, the President, along with the members of the Guyana delegation, yesterday met with a number of high forest, low deforestation rate countries to discuss the issue of avoided deforestation. Among the countries present were Suriname, Belize and Bhutan, as well as representatives from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. During the discussions, advisor to the President, Sham Nokta, along with a representative from the Mackenzie Group, made a presentation on the work Guyana has been doing on valuing forest opportunity costs and avoided deforestation. This presentation was well received, and there was a general agreement among the countries as well as the CCCC to collaborate and work closer on the issue of forests and climate change and in the negotiations at the level of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's conference.
Government's motion in recognition of International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women on November 25th has been passed in Parliament unopposed. The bill, tabled yesterday by Human Services Minister Priya Manikchand, called on the National Assembly to condemn the acts in all its forms. Edward Lane reports.
Guyana has been a signatory to the United Nations Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in the 1980s and has since drafted several strategies to tackle this phenomenon. In moving a motion to this effect, Human Services Minister Priya Manikchand said enough is not being done and has charged parliamentarians to get involved in the fight against this scourge.
We must work towards a strong network of services where service is provided for those who have survived and for those who are struggling to survive. We must teach our daughters to expect equality for themselves and others and demand this when it's not given freely. We must teach our sons to question sexism and concepts and acts of dominance and to reject violence and respect women as equals.
Minister Manik Chand's motion underscores the many achievements and initiatives taken by government over the years and seek to chart a way forward for government, NGOs, political parties and civil society. But despite a heated debate and much questions from the opposition, the motion was passed. PNCR's Valda Lawrence, in supporting the motion, called for a more holistic approach to the issue.
I call on all members of Parliament and every citizen to work assiduously and honestly towards stamping out violence of every form and thus restoring dignity to our society. Forget about lip service. Let the work begin now.
Meanwhile, AFC's Ivla Franklin says that there is need for more male role models and religious organizations to be more actively involved in the fight.
I rise to support this motion. I doubt any member of this House could or would do otherwise. We have a very enthusiastic minister.
And Health Minister Dr. Leslie Ramsamy says violence against women placing a greater and unnecessary burden on the public health system. He estimated some $100 million being spent annually on treating women and children who were abused. This motion paves the way for the tabling of the Sexual Violence Act in the House shortly. Edward Lane, the 6 o'clock news.
57-year-old Hemwati Bihari of Hatfield Street has been granted bail in the sum of $100,000 for embezzlement. She pleaded not guilty to the charge, which states that on November 24, she embezzled $393,000 from her employer. The court heard that the woman is a clerk at a Guy Oil service station. The matter continues in January 2009.